Well, thank you all for being here. It's been a great conference. I've enjoyed my time here. I enjoyed all the discussions we've been having, and Redeemer is a beautiful place, so it's nice to be here. I'm Dr. Gabriel Haley. I'm an associate professor of English at Concordia, and I guess as I get into my bio here a little bit, I should say we're going to lead in the direction that says authorial identity is not that important. I want to say a little bit about my background. I grew up in a Rapture church, but I'm still here. And I became a Calvinist by the time I was in high school, and then in college at Hillsdale, when all my friends were converting to Catholicism, I read Chesterton, and it made me Lutheran. I feel like I'm often in a position at Concordia, and a lot of places I go, I feel like I'm often in the position of being a cultural translator, and I don't always know all the dialects. And one of those things I think classical educators run into is that they feel this way too, because you can be enculturated in something, or maybe you're new to it, but when you're in something, it's sometimes hard to translate it to other people, right? No matter how long we've been involved in classical education, we might feel inadequate at communicating a good definition. I think, Lutheran, we find ourselves, it's easier perhaps to define what Lutheran education is, but classical is difficult, I think. For what it's worth, and I know there are a lot of good elevator pitches out there for classical ed. For what it's worth, I'll give you my 2-point definition. It's pretty quick. I tell people that classical education includes particular content. It teaches foundational sources, right? We're going ad fontes. But second, it promotes a particular disposition towards those sources, one that looks for what is good and true and beautiful. That's my simple elevator pitch for what classical education is. And I think my talk today gives me a chance to dig into that a little bit more. I think any definition of classical Lutheran education, but any definition of classical education more broadly speaking, ought to make reference to those fontes, the inclusion of specific texts which in the modern era have been called the great books. Now this is the popular English translation of the Latin boni literae, a phrase which I will gloss here as, and it's a clumsy gloss, the culturally and aesthetically important writings that are not sacred scripture and yet are useful for moral and ethical living and instruction. First, that first part. Great books are culturally and aesthetically important. Great books might be culturally important simply because they inevitably inform our knowledge of history. Here we attend to the truth of things. For example, if you want to know about the concept of democracy, you better read some Greeks. You should read de Tocqueville. You should read Jefferson. And now another point of guidance, one that maybe gets ignored more, is we should also be looking for beauty. Great books might be aesthetically important in that they are an excellent representation of a particular craft. This is one way, by the way, that the classical education canon is still adding to its bookshelf. But we'll talk later about why we are conservative in this regard, right? We prefer the older to the newer. The boni literae, though, has never been an entirely closed canon. Certain works, like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, or the poems of Emily Dickinson, were at different points in history obscured or lost, so that for a while they did not play an active role in a wide cultural conversation. They might not have been culturally important for a while in an active sense, but have since become active and brought into the stream of our ongoing cultural conversation. But it's because of their aesthetic excellence. They are a product of culture. They reveal their supreme knowledge of craft, and they contribute unique elegances and ideas that can't be found elsewhere. And just as I'm defining things here, modern education will often subdivide that broad category of the great books as literature classes, history classes, philosophy classes, and there's a virtue to the subdivision. But when I'm talking about the great books here, I am talking about that large, capacious category of texts in history, literature, philosophy, and I'm talking about non-scriptural texts. So I'll reiterate my first claim. Any definition of classical Lutheran education, even any definition of classical education, more broadly speaking, ought to make reference to the inclusion of the great books. Implied here, we ought to be prepared to uphold the goodness of the great books. This English phrase emphasizes one part, the great books, that English phrase that emphasizes the one part. It might make it sound like we're talking about things that are just culturally or maybe aesthetically important. They're great. But we don't often hear the moral, the ethical connotations of goodness in there, which is found in that Latin phrase, boni literae, the good books. And here I'll say my background and some of the people I've spoken with over my life I've felt this. I felt a real hesitation about this, right? A real tension about this, that it's hard to get to the point where we valorize certain texts that are not scripture, right? And it feels kind of risky. Solomon, the wisest of all, recognized the weariness that accompanies endless writing, and he himself was seduced by the high places. And though I'm certainly not Solomon, I do know the sin of literary gluttony. I do. I confess publicly that I have sometimes worshipped on the high places. I do just like literature, and I know from experience that many Lutheran educators are suspicious of classical education for this very reason. It seems to love cultures and works that are not sacred scripture, and it seems to love them inordinately. It can seem to want more than the one thing needful. Now, Philip Melanchthon knew this line of argument pretty well. But he sees dissuasions from the great books. Though often coming from theological argumentation, he sees these dissuasions as false temptations in themselves. I think in the last talk, there's a passage from his preface to Homer, and again, I'll return to that. He says, "The unceasing enemy of humankind leads our minds away from admiration and love for what is true and good by whatever kind of deceit he can. And he blinds our eyes by false appearances and obscures them to such an extent that we see and cherish anything rather than that which we should have seen and cherished most." So what happens when we avoid the study of great books is that we end up still making other gods. Only this time they're more of the workaday kind. Maybe we call it our career, the necessity of putting food on the table, anything else that might seem immediately useful to us. Melanchthon continues and he says, "Studies and writings are neglected in our time. Each one rushes towards the mean and gainful arts. They are slaves to their detestable desires and to their stomachs, and they know no God beside these. And he goes further. And here I think we need to listen with some recognition of the genre polemic that he's working within. He compares the kind of humility that seeks to rid education of the good and true and beautiful great books, the elements of culture that classical education preserves. That kind of education has the humility of Herod. When Herod, the king of the Jewish people, was raised to royal honors from humble and obscure origins, he ordered all books containing genealogies to be burnt and destroyed, so that the distinction between nobility and obscurity being removed, the obscurity of his own origins would be less disreputable. In just the same way, uneducated men hate literature and want it destroyed, hoping that thereby they can hide their own ignorance better. Again, part of this is rhetorical, and he soon does ask for forgiveness for the levels to which his complaint and distress has gone. But I think it's a point worth thinking about. Often when we decide for ourselves what is necessary for life, even when we give ourselves a theological justification that sounds good, perhaps we say something like, we seek to know only Christ and Him crucified. Very good thing to say. But we use it as a way to excuse ourselves from loving our neighbor. We end up with another form of idolatry, one baser and meaner, since it worships an ugly and often utilitarian God. We reduce our life and our humanity to mere functionaries, to being mere workers. This is the root of the word robot, the Slavic root of the word robot, robota, workers. The idea that cultural knowledge is at odds with faith, I think, parallels the modern heresy that science is at odds with faith. In both cases, something that merely has the potential to be disordered, it does have the potential to be disordered, is polarized into something intrinsically suspicious and possibly evil. But to withdraw from a good gift of God is to understand God incorrectly. Melanchthon, of course, was a classical educator. In his time, he would have been recognized as a humanist. I have a footnote here. I don't want to go into all of that, but the definition of humanism has changed, and Melanchthon at his time was known as a humanist, and this meant that he promoted an education rooted in the great books, with special attention to the literary skills of rhetoric and eloquence. And the humanist position was distinguishing itself from the scholastic emphasis on logic, on the one hand, and also, actually, the more anti-intellectual stance of the Anabaptists and the youth enthusiasts on the other. So I think when Melanchthon defends the reading of a classic writer like Homer, I think it's fair to say that he is navigating between these two tendencies, the scholastic and the anti-intellectual. The explicit objections to the writing of Homer that Melanchthon fields are in fact rooted in Plato's Republic, where the philosopher famously banishes the poets from his ideal city. And in Melanchthon's day, Plato's critiques of Homer are actually similar to those made by some anti-humanists, some of the anti-humanist Christians. And primarily, one of the main problems with Homer was that he relates ridiculous and absurd things about divinity and about religion. He does. Homer's gods were too fickle, too petty. And if you go back to Tertullian's essay concerning the execrable gods of the heathen, you see him making the same point that Plato's making about Homer's gods. Melanchthon's retort speaks to the historical contingency of the poet and says that that's not the stuff that should occupy us. We should not be obsessed by Homer's inevitable errors. Tell me, what else Homer could have related about the gods or about religion, as it was then in Greece, and whether Plato himself knew and recounted anything better. Again, the point Melanchthon stresses is that there are excellences to be had in Homer, and he spends a good part of his preface to Homer outlining the moral virtues that we can learn from the reading of Homer. Put aside the fickle gods. We must not fixate on his inevitable errors, but instead we should read him to become cultivated. Choosing to dismiss this classic writer is to swerve into the heresies of presentism and utilitarianism, and these are the primary dispositions of modernity. Melanchthon's arguments participate in a long history of thought regarding what the historian John Maribon has called the problem of paganism. It's a good book reviewing kind of Christian thought on how to deal with pagan sources. This is the question of how to relate to the philosophies and cultural contributions of non-Christians. Yesterday we heard Luther and Aristotle and how to navigate Aristotle. And one of the passages, famous passages that was mentioned by Pastor Paul was St. Augustine, right? St. Augustine recounts the instruction given to the people of Israel when they were leaving Egypt. God told them to leave, but also to take with them the gold and the silver, while leaving behind any idols. Augustine says that so also we are to find what is valuable within pagan writings, but to avoid the false gods. He warns that the teachings of the pagans contain not only simulated and superstitious imaginings and grave burdens of unnecessary labor, which each of us leaving the society of pagans under the leadership of Christ ought to abominate and avoid, but he also encourages a discerning reception of what is valuable. The teachings of the pagans, he says, include also liberal disciplines more suited to the uses of truth, and some most useful precepts concerning morals. I think we find St. Paul using this tactic on Mars Hill in Athens when he finds the altar to an unknown god. He recognizes the use of Athenian religiosity and seeks to orient it in the proper direction. What you worship in ignorance, I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, that is in it, since he is the Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made by hand. Paul first draws attention to God's role as the creator who is above and not identified with creation. And he takes Athenian reverence and gives it essential definition and orientation. And in doing so, he actually draws upon pagan poetry, right? In him we live and move and have our being line. And here he's referencing a popular poem called the Phenomena by the Stoic poet Aratus. Of course, Stoic philosophy, the philosophy held by that poet Aratus, who wrote the line, "In him we move and in him we live and move and have our being," that philosophy would be full of false gods and idols. And Paul is sure to distinguish creation from creator. We ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by human skill and thought. Yet at the same time, Paul sees the truth latent in Aratus' poetry. We are indeed God's offspring, and in him we live and move and have our being. So this is our model, right? This is a circumspect, discerning, but still affirmative approach that we can take to great books. It provides the model for cultural education that is sought by classical education. The Lutheran confessions themselves embed such a nuanced approach, and it's, of all people, Aristotle. The apology for the Augsburg Confession in the section on justification includes this little discussion of Aristotle. We have heard that some have set aside the gospel and instead of a sermon explain the ethics of Aristotle. Indeed, such men did not err if those things that the adversaries defend are true. For Aristotle wrote so learnedly about civil morals that nothing further concerning this is necessary. We see books in which certain sayings of Christ are compared with the sayings of Socrates, Zeno, and others, as though Christ had come for the purpose of delivering certain laws through which we might merit the remission of sins, as though we did not receive this freely because of his merits. Therefore, if we receive the doctrine of the adversaries, that by the works of reason we earn remission of sins and justification, there will be no difference between philosophic, or certainly Pharisaic, and Christian righteousness. So, of course, the direct message here is that pastors should not use their sermons to merely outline the ethics of Aristotle. That's not good preaching. Nor should we consider the similarities of Socratic instruction and Christian instruction to suggest that through reason we're able to earn justification. At the same time, there enshrined in our Lutheran confessions is the statement that Aristotle wrote so learnedly about civil morals that nothing further concerning this is necessary. The primary point, just to be clear, is that even a fully formed civic morality cannot save you. Yes. The implication relevant here in my talk is that in the matter of civic morality, Aristotle has done a good job. As long as we know that the Nicomachean ethics can't save us, we can admit that the Nicomachean ethics point us towards works that are indeed good. This passage from the Apology now indicates something kind of interesting, which is the inclusion of pagan philosophy and not just pagan literature. One might posit a distinction saying that literature is allowed flights of fancy, like Homer's petty gods. So such errors are just more easily dismissed. Literature is that safer space, right, where you can say crazy things. Philosophy, on the other hand, it seeks to articulate truth, and so we must deal with it more severely. There's truth there. When we are not turning to philosophy for our salvation, though, when we have a proper ordering of the goods that God gives us, then we are ready to treat the great books truly as fontes, as a source of active, refreshing water, something good. It's this approach that we see throughout the Middle Ages, and one that persists with fervor in the Renaissance, as new sources were discovered rapidly. And it accounts for the Renaissance enthusiasm for a text, and it's a surprising enthusiasm perhaps, a text for something like Plato's Symposium. Today we might turn to that text and read it and find it challenging and become very suspicious of it. We see its acceptance of a deviant sexuality, and we bristle at the philosophical system that strikes us as all too pagan. Remember, the setting of the symposium is a drinking party, and it's a bunch of guys, Socrates included, talking about erotic love. And I don't actually want to dwell on the deviant sexuality in the symposium right now, and all the problems of Plato's Platonism. Actually, if I were to do so, I'm reading more like a modern than like a classical educator. When the symposium was read in the Renaissance as an active stream, as a fontes, rather than as a stagnant pool, something that's just full of dead things, its excellences were the things that were highlighted. Just as the allegory of the cave became an active stream from Plato's Republic, so we can look back to Plato's Republic and think about the value of the allegory of the cave. The allegory of love near the end of the symposium was seen as a choice stream of that text. This allegory comes when it's Socrates' turn to try to explain what love is. And he says that he learns from a woman named Diotima how love of earthly beauty is connected to a higher love of beauty itself. Our love of beauty, Diotima relates, is an intermediary between the temporal, physical beauty and the eternal, transcendent, incorruptible beauty. Our loves of earthly things are thus a school for our love of the eternal. Now, to be sure, it's a challenging text, and I'm smoothing things out here. But it's for the sake of time, but also it gives us a little chance to better hear how a Renaissance Christian humanist, right, would understand the work. Of course, Plato cannot offer the gospel, but he exemplifies here an excellence of reasoning that can orient our moral and ethical life. He does not go in the direction of the Stoics, who would diminish the material things, and he does not go in the direction of the Epicureans, who would diminish the spiritual. Rather, he outlines the connection and proper ordering of earthly beauty and transcendent beauty. Consider how different our modern approaches are to this. They tend to dwell on the historically contingent, the weird factoid, the little curiosity. In doing so, they often isolate the source and make it stagnant. Today, we are generally taught to read for authorial identity, almost whether we like it or not. There's a bias towards understanding the text as an expression of a particular individual identity. We see that in obvious forms in critical race theory and in gender studies, but it does pop up in less obvious ways. We might fixate on Socrates' identity, and we end up understanding him in this modern, isolated sense. Actually, many of my students coming to my Intro to Lit class, they're kind of shocked that I rarely give them author biographies when I'm talking about a text. I mean, it's partly because I'm a teacher of pre-modern literature for the most part, and I often teach anonymous sources, multi-generational sources. And when we have an author's name, like Homer's, we don't have much of a biography. I end up having to say what one of my professors told me, that the Odyssey was written by Homer or by someone of the same name. Maybe he was blind, I don't know. But the point is, we have very little we can say about the identity of Homer, even if we wanted to. And the classical Christian tradition has actually put very little weight on the author's personal identity. In fact, Dante found it necessary to defend using his name in his great poem Commedia, right? Because it was such an unusual point of emphasis. Historians would note that the Renaissance humanists are famous for their more historically focused return ad fontes. Indeed, this includes more emphasis on authorial identification, as well as seeking out the best sources and the best editions of those sources. Yet at the same time, in their reading and interpretive practices, I think they remain intriguingly similar to medieval reading practices. They continued to read in a manner akin to the medieval genre of florilegium. These were the textual anthologies that would transmit the important selections, the pithy sayings, the key passages. And it was a practice of selective reading, looking for and preserving what is most valuable in that text. The humanist practice of preserving the entire text, it certainly contextualizes and nuances, but at the same time, we see that historical data is not their main interpretive concern. They continue to seek what was still living in the text. The ad fontes remained active for them. Or the fontes remained active for them. Merely to find the way a particular person thought at a particular moment in history, that was not sufficient. The way of mere historicism and mere diversity leads to stagnation. This method of preserving what is good or true or beautiful as the great books, avoiding what we might call the puritanical rage for the perfect, it must, of course, be practiced with discernment. And I think C.S. Lewis provides some wise guidance in his essay on the reading of old books, where he explains why it is the old books that we should prioritize. He points out that every era of history makes certain errant assumptions. When we read contemporary books, we are often complicit in what he calls the characteristic mistakes of our day, so that we cannot recognize our own blind points. When we read an old book, its errancies are more obvious to us, like Homer's gods. Rather than taking this as a reason to set the book down, Lewis says it actually makes those errors less of a temptation for us. We easily dismiss what is stagnant in the old books. Like much of Lewis, I think this passage is actually worth reading at length. He says it very well. Nothing strikes me more when I read the controversies of past ages than the fact that both sides were usually assuming, without question, a good deal which we should now absolutely deny. They thought that they were as completely opposed as two sides could be, but in fact, they were all the time secretly united with each other and against earlier ages by a great mass of common assumptions. We may be sure that the characteristic blindness of the 20th century, the blindness about which posterity will ask, but how could they have thought of that, lies where we have never suspected it. And it concerns something about which there is untroubled agreement between Hitler and President Roosevelt, or between H.G. Wells and Karl Barth. None of us can fully escape this blindness, but we shall certainly increase it and weaken our guard against it if we read only modern books. Where they are true, they will give us truths which we half knew already. Where they are false, they will aggravate the error with which we are already dangerously ill. The only palliative is to keep the clean sea breeze of the centuries blowing through our minds. And this can be done only by reading old books. Not, of course, that there is any magic about the past. People were no cleverer then than they are now. They made mistakes as we, but not the same mistakes. They will not flatter us in the errors we are already committing. And their own errors, being now open and palpable, will not endanger us. Two heads are better than one, not because either is infallible, but because they are unlikely to go wrong in the same direction. To be sure, the books of the future would be just as good a corrective as the books of the past, but unfortunately, we cannot get at them. I think this is a profound passage, and it encourages a very practical, non-idolizing view of the great books. I will add one point here, which I think is in harmony with Lewis's other writings, like The Abolition of Man, that by neglecting the cultural inheritance that looks to the great books as corrective to our modern errors, the future's bonae literae may in fact fail us in one essential way: they cease to be. Loss of literacy, a fully dark age. This is the extreme end of the avoidance of cultural preservation. As classical Lutheran educators, let's be vigilant in preserving our sources by not idolizing our sources. Let's also avoid falling into modern habits that merely historicize. And I'll mention again, for many modern Christian, many Lutheran educators, and I know them, it's the privileging of certain non-scriptural texts that poses the biggest hurdle to accepting the classical approach. It's not driven by a kind of progressive ideology or adherence to a modern theory, even though often the methods that are end up selected are related to these. They end up being the default alternatives. These are indeed the contemporary blindnesses of many a modern Christian. We must be careful to realize that for many, the suspicion of classical education comes from a legitimate concern, a concern to uphold the first commandment. Let's be good brothers and sisters in Christ. When we communicate the good of classical Lutheran education, we must be able to communicate this proper ordering of loves. And we must also model an appropriate love of our sources. Thank you. It's the end of the conference, so we can get out of here. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yes.
Being self-read and favorite book.
But that's not a question to ask an English professor. No, no. It's all of them. No, not all. So I actually get this because I'm an English professor. I get this question a lot, right? And so I have a go-to answer, which is Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. And the reason is I have not read it since 8th grade. And I had such a great experience reading Great Expectations in 8th grade. I almost don't want to do it again. You know, but I love Dickens. I do. I'm a medieval Renaissance guy, but Dickens is, I do. I love him. And Great Expectations just hit me so much that I think it's part of why I'm an English professor. That's literature. In terms of most influential other work, I mentioned it earlier, probably Chesterton's Orthodoxy was, and again, I'm talking about influences here. There's so many great books. I'd probably have to put Dostoevsky and Shakespeare somewhere up there too, because I love them both too. And Chaucer. Chaucer gives me the model of what literature can be, I think. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
What would you say is the classic work that you teach in class that your students or you are most surprised that they actually enjoy a lot?
Well, because I've taught, the Odyssey so many times, it's just a mixed bag. I get some people who really, really like it, and some people. I've seen, so the way I teach Dante in Intro to Literature is I give very few selections and I talk about it a lot, right? Because I'm trying to cover a lot in a semester, and for many, jumping into Dante is a really hard thing to do. But I've had multiple students come away just loving Dante. And I guess that's surprising. I mean, I love Dante, so I'm not surprised, and I know Dante is great. But I think given, I guess, the shortness of the selections, I mean, I give them Inferno 1 through 5, and I don't make them read all of it. So, given the partial reading that they have, to have them come away appreciating Dante that much, I guess I'm happy to see that. Yeah.
Is that like a freshman level?
That is. Yes, it's our Introduction to Literature course, which most people take as freshmen. They don't have to. It's not like a sequenced thing, but it's something that's encouraged that they take early, and I tell everybody to take it their freshman year when I talk to them. So, yeah. Yes.
Building on your prior answer, I have found Dante difficult. What's the best preparation to get to Dante?
I think a guide like Esalen is really good. I think reading somebody who appreciates Dante like that and understands Dante's medieval worldview is good. So, if you read Esalen's translation, and his notes are a good guide through Dante. There's some good essays. There's a new book I haven't read. I'm trying to remember the title. that looked good. I have it on my shelf. So I think having a guide, like Dante did, it also helps to go through a little bit of like, do the epic tradition, right? Get a little bit of knowledge in that, and read, the Odyssey, know something about Virgil before you meet him in Inferno, and so it does help to get a little bit of that background. Virgil I love too. He's one of my favorite, and reading Virgil in Latin is it's Virgil and Horace. Reading them in Latin is what taught me how to read poetry. I thought I knew how to read English poetry, and then I learned how to read Latin poetry, and I can read English poetry a lot better. I'm not saying you have to do that first, but Virgil, having some knowledge of Virgil is a good intro to Dante. Other questions? All right. Well, thank you all for being here, and thanks for all of you for being a part of this conference. It's such a great community. I appreciate it. Blessings.